everyone, I'm Matt, back with another update. This is going to be a follow-up video to the previous series, Back to the Rapture. And there was a couple studies that I wanted to get to that I didn't get to in that series simply because it was already like 4 hours long between those three different videos. And so I wanted to do this follow-up, which is really looking at those things pertaining to the end. And really, I would suggest you go back and watch the previous videos if you haven't already done so, because they'll give you the context for what I'm going to share here. We're going to get into a study here in a little bit, but in this intro, I kind of just want to discuss a few things that are upcoming with this study, and also just encourage you guys to go back and watch the third video if you haven't seen it in that series. A lot of you watched the first video, but then not so many people watched the second and third video. I know there's a lot of information to absorb, but one thing I want to say is that I don't actually get into what is hidden in Back to the Future in those first two videos. Those first two videos are just setting up the groundwork for what happens in the third video. It's not until about partway into the third video that I actually go into all of the symbolic and typological things that are hidden in the movie Back to the Future, and how really it's a hidden story related to the rapture and the mystery of the seven thunders, which are talked about in Revelation chapter 10. And just to share one quick example, and I'll probably share this in the upcoming study too. For example, we see that in the movie Back to the Future, Marty McFly has to go down Main Street, which basically coincides with this Highway 395, and again, it's probably just a fictional highway, but anyway, he has to go down 395 at 88 miles per hour in order to go back to 1985. Well, if you go to Genesis 1:1, the very first verse in the Bible, we find something interesting. You might wonder why we'd want to go to Genesis 1:1. Well, one of the reasons Genesis 1:1 is so important is because God says He declares the end from the beginning. We read about that in Isaiah 46:10, for example. And obviously, Genesis 1:1 is the beginning of the Bible, and so there are many things that God has declared in that verse, and many of them are obviously hidden. But many, in particular, there are things pertaining to the rapture of the church that are hidden in the beginning in Genesis 1:1. At any rate, if you go in the movie Back to the Future, he goes 88 miles per hour down 395 to go back to 1985. Well, if you look at the last few words in Genesis 1:1, the value for heaven, for example, is 395 in Hebrew, but its English value is 88. And so there's 395 and 88 right there. And then the two following English values for the English words that follow, which is and the earth, are 19 and 85. And so you have 395, 88, and 1985 embedded in Genesis 1:1. And those things come up in sequence in the movie Back to the Future. That's just one example. I just thought I'd throw out that little nugget just to show an example of what is hidden in that film. But at any rate, one of the things that I do in the previous series is I presented a timeline which is basically bracketed from 2022 to 2028. Now, obviously, I should mention that there are other significant years at the end beyond 2028. 2029, 2030, 2031, even 32 are all significant. But really, as far as concerning this period of high watch for the church and concerning the rapture, the years 2022 to 2028 are the most significant for us believers who are looking for the return of the Lord. And so that's why I've kind of bracketed it around those years. But anyway, one thing I mentioned in the previous study is I don't really explain how we got that timeline. I show the evidence for that timeline in many other videos, and I will probably briefly recap it after I do this intro to show kind of some of the origin of some of those points. But just to break it down, I want to go over some of the major bookends and milestones of that timeline, because we're going to see that even if you don't know where it comes from, you're going to see that as we go through these studies on the end, that these milestones, these dates, and these particular years are referenced time and time again in various ways throughout Scripture. And so, for example, we have 2022 and 2024 and 2025 are significant years that are identified in that time, as well as obviously 2028. 2022 is kind of really where it began. If we want to be technical, we could say 2021. And I'll probably talk about that more later. But at any rate, there's one of the things that the Lord began showing back in 2022 is this timeline leading up to basically this anniversary date on Heshvan 27, which would have been 227 on the calendar of Noah's time, the antediluvian calendar as we call it, and that day is mentioned in Genesis 8:14, and it is basically the point at which the earth becomes dry. It's the end of the flood. It's when Noah and his family can finally begin their new life in this new world. And so there's some obviously symbolic significance there. And remember, Jesus Christ is the ark, and the greater fulfillment. At any rate, this day of 227, which we read about in Genesis 8:14, comes up time and again in regards to God's plan for the end. And the first milestone marker that God really highlighted this for was in 2024. And in that year, that day, Heshvan 27, was on November 28th, which for those of us in North America, that happened to be Thanksgiving. And I say happened to because there are no coincidences with God. There's actually a little prophetic typology God arranged in relation to Thanksgiving around that time. I did a video on it a while back called Upside Down Turkey Day, because there's actually a picture story God put in the earth connected to the country of Turkey that relates to this turning point in God's plan. And so that God actually not just exercising and demonstrating his sovereignty with that particular typology, but also a little bit of his sense of humor. But at any rate, from that point, back in 2024, it appeared that we were at the end of this roadmap, this timeline that God began to reveal in 2022. However, obviously we're still here. God had conveyed subsequently at that time that there would be this another year, and he conveyed that through many parables that talk about another mile, another cubit. There's if somebody compels you to go a mile, go with him twain. There was all these little clues that God provided. There'd be another year to get to the end of this 3-year sequence from 2022, and that would lead us to another accounting of Heshvan 27 in 2025, which was November 18th, and that brings us 3 years out from the anniversary for the start of the flood, plus 10 days, back in 2022, which is the initial appointed time, is that time that the Lord began to tarry. I've talked about that in previous studies. At any rate, and then God also hints at this in many parables. For example, in the hidden loaves parable, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like, 3 measures of meal, which a woman took like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal. There's obviously good and bad applications and connotations to leaven, biblically speaking. But one of the things God was doing with that parable was prophetically speaking of 3 hidden years. The word meal occurs 12 times in the Bible, and there are 12 months in a year, and God will often use 12 to represent a year. So when he said 3 measures of meal, he was talking about 3 12s or 3 years. And from 2022 to 2025 were 3 hidden years. However, we read that parable is reiterated again later in Luke, and you have it in Matthew and Luke. And that was probably, in hindsight, in retrospect, I think it was a clue God was giving us that these 3 hidden years would repeat again. And so we'd have a repeating, if you will, of these 3 hidden years from 2025, or between 2022 to 2025. They would have to repeat again from 2025, which would bring us out to 2028. Another way that this is conveyed, and I covered this in the previous series, is that the Lord comes to snatch us away like a thief in the night. There's many places in Scripture that I'm sure many of you are familiar with where the Lord describes his coming. He comes upon the world as a thief, and he comes to snatch us as a thief in the night. If we go to Exodus 22:7, or the fullness of 22, God conveys that the price of a thief is double. And so one of the things that we're repaying during this period that the Lord tarries is this payment of currency or money in time. And God will often use money to represent time in many different ways in Scripture. And so God was conveying prophetically for us, if we follow these puzzle pieces that He's put throughout His Word, that we would get to that initial 3 years that appeared to be the mark for the end in 2025. But then we'd have a double payment in time. And so we have to pay double what we paid from 2022 to 2025. Double 3 is another 3 years. And so that brings us out to 2028. And that's where we get to that third reckoning, if you will, of Echelon 27 in 2028. And there's obviously a lot more details I'm leaving out just to keep this simple. But that's essentially where this timeline comes from. And one of the things that we're going to see is just how many times it is referenced. And one of the incredible things too is that God accounts for some of these years multiple times, and He hints at it in many different ways, and I'll touch on that when we get into the study. For example, 2025 indeed was supposed to be the year, and even still now is connected to the rapture, but really it is a second reckoning of 2025, and that overlaps with 2028 as it apparently appears to be at this time. And one of the typologies God arranged, which I've covered in a previous video, called Treading on Serpents and Scorpions, which I will hopefully link in the description. In that series, I showed that basically one of the ways that God represented this second accounting of 2025 is we're relating it to an echo. And obviously an echo is something that repeats. And so God was conveying that it would repeat. We see evidence of that too, as I mentioned in Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. The very last letter in Genesis 1:1 is the Zodi, which is the 18th Hebrew letter, but it has a value of 90. Well, 90 is 2 times 45, and 45 is one of those ways that God will represent 2025, and there's actually multiple reasons why. So 45 is 20 plus 25, so that's one way you can represent 2025. The square root of 2025 is 45. Additionally, if you look at the 20 and 25 on a clock, like on a standard analog clock, it is the positions 20 and 25. And so there are numerous ways that 45 is connected to 2025. But at any rate, Zodi, which is the last Hebrew letter in Genesis 1:1, it has a value of 90, which is 2 times 45. And so God was given a hint that there would be 2 2025s. Another area where God gave a hint of this is in Proverbs 25:2, where it says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter." Well, God's actually concealing something right in that verse. So it's Proverbs 25:2. Proverbs is the 20th book, or in the 25th chapter, so we have 2025 right there. And then it's in verse 2, indicating that there would be 2. And that was something before 2025 came. I was kind of questioning, like, could God, because here's the difficulty with this, is that 2 is also God's number for a witness. And so God could simply be saying that this is a witness to 2025 being this concealed mystery of the end, which indeed is true. But it could also be saying much more than that, which is that there would be 2 reckonings of 2025. And obviously we didn't know that until we went past that point of Echelon 27 and 2025. But in sum, we have this echo, this second accounting of 2025 that appears now to reside in 2028. And this is also where the 2022 reset appears to reside. And we talked about that in the previous study, where basically the initial point in time for the Lord's return was 2022, but as we read about in Scripture, the Lord tarried. For example, Jesus Himself told us in the parable of the 10 virgins, He says, while the bridegroom tarried, they all slumbered and slept. And so He was not just speaking figuratively, but He was speaking of this literal and precise period of time at the end that He would tarry. And one of the reasons He tarries is because there are things on the accounts of time that have to be balanced before He returns. Basically, time that has to be recredited or refunded. One of those things, for example, is actually the flood itself. Mankind, as we read about in Job 7:1, is appointed a precise amount of time to rule and reign on the earth. There's other places in Scripture where this is conveyed. Well, the flood deprived or took away some of that appointed time from man, and so God is faithful to recredit it or refund it to us, or refund it to the world and man, so to speak. And so one of the things that had to be refunded in time was the flood. There are other things on the accounts as well, including the ministry of Stephen, which again I keep on hinting at that I'll talk about because I've mentioned it in several videos, but I've never actually done a full study on that yet. And so, God willing, I will cover that at some point. And to be honest, one of the reasons I haven't covered it yet is I know enough from what the Lord has shown to know that Stephen and his ministry is part of the equation involved, but I don't fully understand it. And so, part of the reasons I haven't done a full analysis on that yet is because I think I could share just enough to be dangerous if I went into it without letting the Lord lead me there and fill in some of the gaps. And so, that said, I do know that Stephen, and maybe I'll at least share the clues that God has provided for this, that the ministry of Stephen, who was the first martyr of the church, who we read about in Acts 7, believe it or not, is related to the end in a roundabout way in terms of the accounts. And so, again, I might cover that at some point. Like I said, I'm kind of waiting on the Lord to, either give me the nudge to do so, or to provide understanding to some of those parts of that reckoning of accounts that I don't yet understand. But at any rate, there's these things on the accounts that have to be settled before the Lord comes, and that's one of the reasons why the Lord tarries. But with all that said, I don't want to have this intro be too long. I want to get into the study on the end. I just wanted to give a recap on this timeline. Encourage you guys to go back and watch the previous series called Back to the Rapture, and especially if you guys stick around to the third movie or the third video in that series, that's where I actually get into the hidden things in Back to the Future. Like I said, the first two videos are just setting up the context and the groundwork to be able to see those things. But with that said, I hope you guys enjoy these studies that are coming up, and it should hopefully be a blessing to you. Okay, so now we can get into the first follow-up study for the series Back to the Rapture. Again, this is basically a set of studies that I wanted to do at the end of that series that I just didn't have time for, so it's going to be in this follow-up video. But anyway, we're going to look at these key phrases that many of us are familiar with, which are once upon a time and the end. And these are like classic bookends to any good story that we could think of in the past. What's interesting is obviously God is aware of these archetypes, of these motifs that we are familiar with. And in God's sovereignty, he actually uses these things to convey bookends of his own that pertain to his redemptive plan, especially as it pertains to the end. But anyway, as I just kind of mentioned that here, basically the phrases once upon a time and the end go together like bread and butter. And these staple phrases are the start and end of many classic stories throughout time, but they also conceal numeric signatures pertaining to God's plan for the end. The alphanumeric values for the phrases once upon a time and the end are as follows. So if you type in once upon a time, you'll get these values in Hebrew, Standard English, Ordinal English, and the end has these values. Actually, I'll just show that really quick, just so you guys can see. So here, if I go once upon, actually I already have it here, you can see that it is the values for Hebrew. It's 593, it's 906 in English Standard, and 151 in English Ordinal. Likewise, the end is 162, 336, and 56. And we're going to see that these values are not random, that God, just as he's sovereign over Hebrew and Greek, he's also sovereign over English, in fact, over every language. And he knows their values, their letter positions, how those things count and add up. And again, we're not, we don't divine things for ourselves. That's, as what you would do in occultic practices with numerology. However, that said, God does use his numbers. In fact, the fourth book of the Bible is called the Book of Numbers. And one of the things that many of us aren't aware of is just how thoroughly God uses numbers throughout Scripture and throughout his redemptive plan. But at any rate, the words once upon a time occur 176 times together in the same chapter in the Bible. I'll just show that really quick. So I do once, and then move this over here, upon, and a time. not same category, same chapter, you can see that these phrases "once upon a time" occur 176 times together, according to the same chapter. And so, what's interesting about that, obviously, if you went through the previous series, 176 is 11 times 16, and Heshvan 27, or 227 on the antediluvian calendar, is actually November 16th in 2028. And so that's definitely notable. The other thing that's interesting is that the phrase "the end" occurs 150 times. It first occurs in Genesis 6:13, which is verse 151 in the Bible, and obviously that actually has a connection to "once upon a time," as we see here, as word 286 in the chapter. And so I'll just do that really quick to show that. I'll just do a search anywhere in the Bible. To the end. You can see it's first here in Genesis 6:13, and that phrase is word 286 in the chapter. If we go to the last place that the word "the end" is found, it is in Revelation 22:13. And really quick, 22 times 13 is 286, which is what we see here for the first time that the end is used. We can see the 286 connection here. And so you have the first and the last references of the end have a connection numerically to 286. Obviously, here we're seeing a reference to Jesus Christ. I'm Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And again, we've already talked about how the numbers 22 and 13 are actually also related to God's plan for the end, because that initial appointed time was 2022, but it doesn't speak until it comes around again in the Seven Thunders event, which is represented by the number 13. Because remember, the Seven Thunders are first mentioned in Revelation 10:3, and 10 plus 3 is 13. And so again, this review, but just a quick recap. So that said, I want to keep this moving along. And one of the other things I want to mention is that it last occurs in Revelation 22:13, as I just showed. But that verse, if we go back to the end, if we go to the beginning of that verse, we can see right here. We can see that this verse, Revelation 22:13, is verse 396 in the book of Revelation. And that pertains to the last set of the 227 dates. Again, the 227 date we read about in Genesis 8:14, which is verse 198 in the Bible. And so if I go to Genesis 8:14, we can see that it is verse 198 in the Bible, and this is where it mentions the second month, the 7th and 20th day of the month. So this is the 227 date that is linked to the end that we see here in Genesis 8:14, but that verse is verse 198. 198 times 2 is 396, which again is the verse number for the last time that the end occurs in the Bible, which is verse 396 in Revelation. But that 396 again is relating to these two 198s, or these two instances of that 227 date of the end. And obviously there's a set here too, and then we realized that set had to repeat, but we have a reference there. The other thing that's notable is that the phrase "the end" in Genesis 6:13, which is where it first occurs, is word 3,546 in the Bible. That number breaks down to, you'll understand why I color-coded it this way in just a little bit. But essentially that number breaks down to 9 times 2 times 20 plus 25 prime. So we have a reference to fruit. God wants to bring forth the fruit of the harvest of the end of the age. And as we're going to see, there are two 2025s in God's reckoning of the end. Obviously, we already had the first 2025, but there is a second reckoning, or a second accounting of 2025 that reflects later, or echoes, that appears to coincide and reside at this point with 2028. But we had the first 3 years, and as I talked about in the intro, those get reflected again. And so we have the 2025 echo now residing along with the 2022 reset in 2028. But the other thing that's interesting just about this number is that if you look at it, we can see 3 and 5, 4, 6. Again, we have 3 can, I believe, be a reference to this set of 3 years on either side. But also 546 is 13 times 20 plus 22. So a reference to the 7 thunders. And again, 2022 is the initial appointed time. But we're waiting for the reset, so we're waiting for the second 2022, which is connected to 13, which is the reset event concealed in the 7 thunders. And so with all that in mind, the other thing I want to note is that if we go to the last place where Jesus speaks, we see a reference to that number as well. For example, right here, this is the last verse where Jesus speaks, which you see in red right here, where he says, "Surely I come quickly." But this verse is Revelation 22:20, which is 2022 in reverse. But as you can see here, it begins with word 546 in the chapter, which is what we're noting here as standing out. The other thing that's interesting is that, again, it's a review for a lot of you, but I wanted to get us up to speed for anyone who's new. If we go to Titus 2:13, which talks about the blessed hope, which is pertaining to the raptures, it's looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior Jesus Christ. You can see that this verse also begins with 546. In this case, it's not word 546 in the chapter, but rather word 546 in Titus. But nonetheless, it is a 546 reference demarking the beginning of this verse, just as we see it demarking the beginning of Revelation 22:20. Because again, those things, they're connected. Specifically, they're connected by this reset event, which was the mystery that was hidden in the 7 thunders. The phrase "the end" in Revelation 22:13 is word 9 of 15 in the verse, and 9 times 15 equates to 5 times 27. 5, as I've talked about in the previous series, is God's shorthand number for the rapture. It's obviously also God's number for grace, but one of the lesser known meanings or applications of it is that it is God's abbreviated number as well for the rapture. And so we have just a really simple but elegant statement made with the factorization of the end in this verse, which is basically the rapture of the church, which is definitely one of the ends in God's plan. But furthermore, 9 times 15 is also 3 times 20 plus 25. And so we have a reference to 3 years that are connected to 2025. In this case, we actually know there's 3 years on either side of 2025. But in our case, we're concerned about the 3 years that would come to the end here. And the phrase "the end" in Revelation 22:13 is word 790,625 in the Bible. I'll just show that really quick. So if I go down here, you can see that it is word 790,625 in the Bible. Again, these aren't random numbers. God's like a master programmer in his book has perfectly positioned these words and these phrases to convey very precise meaning and markers related to his plan. So just on its own, this number 790,625 equals 5 to the 5th power. So 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times the 253, which is the triangle number of 22. And so, again, for review, if I could calculate the triangle number of 22. We could see that it's 253. But again, the way you would denote this is as T22 to represent this number. And that's one of the ways God represents really the pinnacle of this 22 sequence. And so we have a reference to grace to the 5th power. And so I think in this case, I think it could be either way, but and obviously I want to proceed with caution here. I think God is referring to both grace and the rapture in this case, which is why I have both color-coded accordingly. But really the fullness of grace comes in the rapture, which is what I think the exponent is signifying here. But anyway, 5 to the 5th power times T22. So again, this phrase is not just randomly placed, it's perfectly positioned. But the other thing I want to point out is that if you just break these apart as 790 and 625, they're individually important, because 790 is 10 times 22 prime, because 79 is the 22nd prime number. So if I go down here, this is a list of prime numbers. You can see that the 22nd number right here is 79. And God will often use prime numbers to encode other numbers. And so basically 790 is 10 times 79, but really it's 10 times 22 prime. And so we have a reference to 10 as God's number for time and 22 prime. Additionally, I would say that this could also be broken down as 5, which again is God's number for grace or the rapture, times 2 times 22 prime. Again, because there's 2022s in God's plan for the end. But additionally, we also see that 625 is 25 times 25. And so we have this reference to 2 by shorthand abbreviation anyways. We have a reference to 2 2025s as well. So yeah, again, 25 squared is 625. No, go away, Copilot. I don't know why that even came up. But anyway, so that's definitely interesting that we would expect the end of the phrase "the end" to have some very significant prophetic markers, which is indeed what we're seeing right here. The other thing I want to show, though, is that the phrase "once upon a time," again, remember that value in Hebrews 593. Well, 593 is the 108th prime number. So if I go down to 108, you can see that it is 593. And 108 is a way you can represent this last set, because you have that 227 date, but 2 times 27 is 54. But two 54s, or 54 plus 54 would be 108. It's one of the ways you can represent this date twice, is with this number. And we see that once upon a time, that phrase is relating to this number. And again, we had it once here in this first set, and we're waiting for another time that it occurs again, at the end. The other thing that's notable is we can see that the Hebrew value for the phrase "the end," which we see here, we can see how it's 162. Well, 162 is 3 times 54, or 3 times 2 times 27. So we have a reference to 2 27s in God's plan for the end. So even the Hebrew value of the phrase "the end" is pointing to a set of 3 227s. So pretty, just an incredible example of God's sovereignty. And again, I want to put a caveat on all of this. There could be some additional twist to how the third 227 works out. And so, we obviously we wait on the Lord to see how He fulfills all these things, but we can definitely see God's hand in all of this, His sovereignty, and the way that He, like a master programmer, has codified a lot of these things in His Word and even in the languages that we find throughout His creation. So now we're going to look at a couple of these values, but before I get into them, I need to talk about the number 36. 36 is linked to marriage, inheritance, consummation, and judgment. That's also linked to the land. There's a lot of different things that are linked to 36. I hope to do maybe a study on that number at some point, biblically showing how that number is used throughout Scripture. But at any rate, here's just a couple examples. Daniel 9:27 talks about the consummation, for example. We go to Daniel 9, we go to the last verse. It mentions even until the consummation right here. Well, 9 plus 27 is 36. It's also linked to inheritance. We see this, for example, in Numbers 36. There's this theme of inheritance. And by the way, Numbers 36 is chapter 153 in the Bible. And this relates to the 153 fish that we read about in John 21, which are symbolic or typological of the rapture and the harvest that happens at the end of the age. It's also worth noting that Habakkuk 3 is chapter 906 in the Bible and followed by book 36. In 906, we can see the reference here, but Habakkuk 3 is important because it's related to that prophecy of the end that we read about in Habakkuk 2. It's basically a continuation, if you will, of that end times prophecy. But at any rate, it's also followed by Zephaniah, which is book 36, which is prophetically significant as well. But anyway, the reason 36 is important is because when we look at this phrase "once upon a time," we can see that its English and ordinal vowels are 906 and 151, but 906 is 6 times 36 prime, and 151 is the 36th prime number. And here's where we're going to see more just confirmation of these 3 milestones of the end. So we already looked at the Hebrew value for the end. Now we're going to look at the English standard value, which we can see here is 336. And that value breaks down into a couple interesting things. For one, it is 8 times 42. 8 is God's number for new beginnings or new birth. Sometimes it simply means something that is new. And we're actually see how that plays out later. So we're looking at a new 42. And remember, 42 is 20 plus 22. It's one of the ways that God represents 2022. And obviously we had the first 2022 already passed. We're looking for a new 2022, which in this case would be the second one, or a reference to the reset. Additionally, we can see that 336 is 12 times 28. Again, as I talked about in the intro, there are 12 months in a year. God will often use 12 to represent a year, so we're looking at the year of 28. In this case, I do believe he's referring to the year of 2028, and 28 is just shorthand for that. And so we have a reference there. Furthermore, if we look at how the digits break down and form different products, it's actually pretty fascinating. So we have this number 336. If we just break it apart into the different components, we see something interesting. 3 times 6 is 54, or 2 times 27. So we have one reference to that 227 date just built into that digit product. But also, we can also break it apart as 3 and 36. 3 times 36 is 108, which we see here, again, that last set, the 254s. Furthermore, 33 times 6 is 198. And remember, verse 198 is the verse in the Bible that mentions that 227 date. And so there's essentially 3 different witnesses, 3 different ways built into this number that represent the same, essentially the same convergence point, just in a variety of different ways. And then finally, the English ordinal value for the end is 56, 2 times 28. And again, we're looking for that second 28, which is 2028. The seventh occurrence of the phrase "the end" is in Exodus 12:41. Now, there's obviously, like I said, the phrase "the end" occurs, I think, 150 times in the Bible. We're not going to look at every single one, but we're going to look at a few key ones. One of the reasons why we would want to look at the seventh occurrence of the phrase "the end" is because 7 is one of God's divine numbers, and it's usually one of his numbers for completion or fullness. And so, very often, if God presents a very important word or phrase, I'm often interested in seeing what the seventh, usually the first and the last are usually going to be likely the most important, but beyond the first and the last mentions, usually the seventh mention, or sometimes the fifth mention, it depends what it is, are usually the most important as well. And we're going to see that to be the case here. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, and this is so important because God's given if it would just said at the end of 430 years, it wouldn't be as prophetically significant, but this actually changes the hidden context of what's being concealed here. Anyway, it says, even in the selfsame day it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. This verse is verse 1858 in the Bible, which is 2 times 929. Well, 929 is the 158th prime number, but 158 is 2 times 79, and as we talked about earlier, 79 is the 22nd prime number. So when you break it all down, this is a reference to 2 22s, when just concealed through prime numbers. And again, we're looking at 2 22s in God's plan for the end. And we're talking about an end here. Now, obviously, this is an end for the Israelites in the historic narrative, but very often God has secondary applications, or basically double prophecies, or even sometimes triple prophecies built into his word, into these events. So we're looking at a secondary, far-off application that is being concealed, and now obviously revealed to us at the end. It's also worth noting that chapter 929 is the end of the Old Testament. So that's Malachi 4. So if I go to the end of the Old Testament, and go to the last chapter, you can see that it is 929, and so it's also symbolic of an end, and we're talking about an end here. This number 929, which is related to an end, is also significant. 9 times 2 times 9 is 162, which is, again, the value for the end in Hebrew. And again, 162 is 3 times 2 times 27, going back to the these 3 227s that we see here in this timeline of the end. And the phrase "the end" in Exodus 12:41 is word or phrase 47,466 in the Bible. That is again, we have another reference to 162 times 293. 293 is the 62nd prime number, and I covered that in the previous series, Back to the Rapture. I did a little snippet where I showed, for example, in Psalm 62, that it is a reference to an hourglass. And so very often God will use the number 62 to refer to an hourglass or a completion of time. Again, I won't break apart and do another study on that right now because it would just bloat this video even longer. But like I said, you could go back and watch where I cover that briefly. The phrase "the end" in Exodus 12:41 is word or phrase 9,204 in Exodus, and that is 2 times 13 times 354. So again, 13 is God's number for the seven thunders, but particularly we're interested very often in the expression 2:13 or 2 times 13, because that's linked to the actionable event, and it's really linked to our blessed hope. For example, it's not a coincidence that Titus 2:13 talks about our blessed hope, because that is the event linked to the seven thunders, where the Lord appears to us to gather us to himself. But then obviously we all have this other factor, 354, which if you just look visually at it, we can see a 3 and 54. Again, 54 is 2 times 27. So, just very notable, to say the least. The phrase "the end" in Exodus 12:41 is word or phrase 12:28 in the chapter, and we saw that 12:28 referenced just a little bit ago. Here, that 336 is 12 times 28, the year of 28. And we can see that in this particular case, the seventh occurrence of the phrase "the end," that it is word or phrase 12:28 in the chapter. But furthermore, that number itself breaks down to 4, which is the number of the door, times 307. And that is interesting because that's also related to the end. The word "end," so we're looking at the end, but if you just look at the word "end," you can see that it occurs 307 times. And so God will often use 307 as a proxy for an end. And obviously we're looking at the end in this particular case, but the word "end" itself is also significant. It occurs 307 times. The other thing that's interesting is Exodus 12 is chapter 62 in the Bible, and as I just mentioned, 62 is God's number for the hourglass, and so there's definitely a significant connection there. It's also verse 325 in Exodus, which is 13 times 25. So we have a reference to the seven thunders. 25 represents the fullness of grace, but it also can be shorthand for 2025. If we look at a sum of this verse, it is book 2 plus 12 plus 41, and that's 54. And 54 again is that a reference to that 227 date. If we add, and there's 37 words in this verse, 37 is actually related to the window of the end. I haven't talked about that too much in this series. I've talked about it more in the past. But anyway, if you add basically the entire verse together plus its word count, you get this total of 92, which is 4 times 23. Again, a reference to the door. 23 is often shorthand for the 2023 reversal, which if you came from the previous study, I briefly covered that, which basically, to summarize, it's a sequence linked to the rapture of the church. And we're going to see how that is not only do we have it in the notation here referenced, we're going to see how actually the content of the verse itself is alluding to this sequence as well, because it has the number 430 mentioned. The number 430 is mentioned, offering an allusion to the 2023 reversal. The 2023 reversal of the end consists of the years of 430. And this is why I think that the is intentionally placed there. It could have been left out and still had made sense. But this is providing some additional resolution to the end time application, because there are years that are linked to this number 430. So it's basically kind of like a pun or a play on words. The 430 breaks down to 10 times 23 plus 20. And that's one of the ways that God represents this sequence of the end that can be identified as a 2023 related backward sequence, or reverse sequence. I just simply call it the 2023 reversal, because that's the quickest way to succinctly describe it. But that said, it's not like it's coming out of thin air. It's this thing that God refers to in Scripture, even by this statement of it being in reverse. So here's an example from Numbers 23:20, where he says, "Behold, I have received commandment to bless, and he hath blessed, and I cannot reverse it." And so basically God is saying, this is the prophet Balaam, the Lord's obviously speaking through him though, this sequence, this reverse sequence of the 2023 reversal cannot be reversed, is basically what God is hinting at here. And if you do a deep dive and a deep study on this sequence and what it's connected to, it's clear that it's connected to the rapture of the church in the far prophetic application. Again, in the local historic narrative that this occurs in Scripture, it's referring to a blessing given to the children of Israel. But there is a secondary or an additional application hidden in this verse that is related to the rapture of the church. Again, it's codified. I'm not going to break it down completely. One thing I will mention, though, is that the word that they use here for bless and blessed is this Hebrew word that has a Hebrew value of 222. And 222 is one of the ways that God represents 2022, obviously without the zero. And so there's two of them being represented in the verse because, again, that blessing of the end is linked to two 2022s. And so that's just one little hint I wanted to share, just showing how God codifies some of this. But at any rate, one of the other things that's interesting is that the last word in Numbers 23:20 is word 2288 in the book of Numbers. Again, we have reference to 88 and 22. Really, the sequence of the end began in the year 2022, and 88, as we talked about in the Back to the Rapture study, is symbolic of this route to the end. But additionally, this number actually breaks down to 88 times 251, but 251 is the 54th prime number. And so it really breaks down to 88 times 2 times 27. So we're looking for that sequence, that route of 88 to get us to the last 227, really, which is where we would receive that blessing. And it's interesting too. It talks about one can reverse it, but there actually is a reversal involved. Remember, even the title, when we think of the world typology God provided with the movie Back to the Future, back can be an equivalent phrase to reverse. But there's obviously some other mappings involved. I don't want to get into that right now, but anyway, that connection I think is very interesting. So anyway, we have the, again, just to reiterate, we're looking towards this from 22 along Route 88, essentially, to get to this last 227. And again, right now it appears to be the last 227. When we get there, as we approach that day, God may reveal somehow that there's something tethered to this day that either subtracts it or adds to it. Right now it seems pretty dialed in on this day. But again, we wait on the Lord to see what he shows. Things appeared pretty dialed in for the first iteration in 2025. And then God revealed, oh no, we have the thief's payment or the double payment for this to happen again. That there'd be a second reckoning, if you will, of 2025, this echo. And that was definitely I don't want to say a completely unexpected twist, because there were hints God was providing that this could be the case. But certainly many of us who were waiting for the Lord were hoping that this would have been the time that he came. But at any rate, just as we look at all this evidence, we're going to see a powerful convergence of evidence on this date. But like I said, there's always the caveat or the advisory warning, if you will, that we need to be cautious that we don't get so tunnel visioned on that we can miss some other detail that God is perhaps showing us that shows how this really unfolds. But anyway, I just wanted to break this down a little bit further. So not only is the word 22,088 in the book of Numbers, but it is word 117,576 in the Bible. And that's important because 117, which you see here, is God's number for dividing and resurrection. 576 is another numeric form of the 2023 reversal. And I want to mention two. I think if I type in once, the first time, 18 times 32, you can see that the first time once occurs in the Bible is in Genesis 18:32, and 18 times 32 is 576, which is also what we have here. Where it ties into this theme of once upon a time. There's actually more to it than that, but at any rate, 576 is the triangle number of 24, which is 300, plus the triangle number of 23, which is 276. So it's T24 plus T23. These numbers relate to, again, the 2023 reversal. It's another form of that sequence, another way to represent it. But additionally, 576 is also 24 squared. That was, remember, the initial timeline came to an end, or it appeared to come to an end in 2024. Then God showed that 2024 is essentially going to flip over into this upside down sequence into 2025, and now we're learning that both of those things carry forward, and to this later point that it appears to reside in 2028. And so we're also not only are waiting for 2022 and 2025 to come to completion, we're waiting for 2024, a second iteration to come to completion as well, along with the 2023 reversal. In a conceptual sense, you can think of God like rolling up a scroll, like taking all these years of the end and rolling them up like a scroll. So that's why, and when you do that, things will tend to overlap. Hopefully that's a visual that helps to understand that. But at any rate, we're going to see too that the numbers 23 and 24 relate to 47's God number, which is another way that God represents the sequence of the end. And if I go to Daniel 2:47, actually I think I'm going to touch on this in just a little bit, so maybe I'll hold off on this. So we have that. So again, another thing to take note of is that this number for it, which God is saying we can't reverse, is equivalent to 2 times T23, which again, the triangle number of 23 is yet another way that the 2023 reversal may be represented, times 213, again, 213s, and the number 213 itself can be a proxy for the blessed hope, which is what we read about in Titus 2:13. And again, like I said, in other ways that this verse breaks down, God is clearly showing that the hidden blessing that he's codified in this sequence is related to the rapture of the church when we fly away. Speaking of which, God codifies this in the very first book of the Bible. So 5, like I said, is God's number for grace. It's also God's shorthand number for the rapture. If we go to the 5th day, which is symbolic of grace and the rapture, in God's creation account, we're going to see something interesting. So we can see it mentions the 5th day in verse 23, but the 5th day actually begins in verse 20 after the 4th day. So after we get to the end of the 4th day, and we get to verse 20. But if we go from the 5th day, which is mentioned in verse 23, and we go backwards to verse 20, that represents 23:20 in reverse, which is what we see in Numbers 23:20. And in this verse, when we go from 23 to 20 backwards for the 5th day, it says, "And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life," and we have life in Christ when we're born again, "and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of the heaven." And so it's a little, again, God, the more and more you come into these deep studies of Scripture, the more you see God's sense of humor and also God's creativity and his love for play on words and puns. And this is a case where God's given a little hint, if you see the things that he's codified, of what we have to look forward to in this 23:20 reverse sequence. We get to fly above the earth. Specifically, we fly above the earth in the rapture. And I want to mention, too, you can see here that the word fly above the earth, this phrase, you can see over here is 433. If I go to the number 433, you can see that it is the 84th prime number. And you might wonder why that's important. Well, 84 divided by 2 is 42. And 42 is 20 plus 22. And so 84 is one of the ways that God represents the two 2022s at the end. It's 2 times 20 plus 22. So a way to codify these two 2022s at the end. And it just so happens that this phrase, fly above the earth, as I show here, is word or phrase 433 in the Bible, which again points to 84 via a prime number, which is a way God codifies two 42s or two 2022s. So that's when we fly above the earth. So at any rate, a little bit of a detour, but I thought that'd be a blessing to at least share that detour. The Numbers 23:20 has the 1,352nd mention of the word "it" in the Bible. So obviously the word "it" occurs many times in the Bible, but this is the 1,352nd time that it occurs. And again, if this shows where you have to have faith that these things, if you know that these things aren't random, if you know that God has perfectly measured His word, then you know that these things are significant. Well, this number breaks down to 8, which again is God's number for new beginning or new birth, and 13 squared, which is God's number for the fullness of the seven thunders, because it's 13 times 13. And so we're looking for, again, this new birth, this new beginning that is associated with the fullness of the seven thunders. So, like I said, we're not going to look at every instance of the end, but the other ones that are significant is the 108th occurrence of the phrase "the end," which we see in Amos 8:10. It says, "And I will turn your feasts into mourning, all your songs into lamentation, and I will bring up sackcloth upon all loins, and baldness upon every head, and I will make it as the mourning of an only son, and the end thereof as a bitter day." Now, obviously, the end is a blessing for those who are found in Christ, but it's a bitter day for those who have not received Him or accepted Him or rejected Him. In this case, we know the context is a looking towards Israel. Israel will be, those who call upon the Lord of Israel will be redeemed in the end. But for now, they are currently rejecting the Messiah. But at any rate, we see that the phrase "the end" is word or phrase 42, again, 20 plus 22 of 48 words total in the verse. And 48 obviously is 20 plus 28. So we have the two bookends of this timeline of the end, basically codified between the end and the last word in the verse. And again, 108 is important because that is that set, right? The last set that we're concerned with, which is this set right here. So obviously we want to see the 108th mention of the phrase "the end" and see if it's important. And as we see here, it's already given us some interesting clues. It is phrase 296 in Amos 8. 296 is the Hebrew value of the earth in Genesis 1:1. The word for earth ends with zadi. Really quick, I'm going to show that. I think I could show right here. Sorry, should have had this up already. But okay, so you can see here, this is the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Although I put it in the order of Hebrew, but then flip the Hebrew so that it's left to right. But you can see that the last word is the earth, which has a value of 296 in Hebrew. And it ends with zadi, which has a value of 90, and it's the 28th letter. And again, this is review if you guys watched the second video in the series. But at any rate, what's interesting about this connection is that zadi is letter 18 with a value of 90, and 18 plus 90 is 108, and we're looking at the 108th occurrence of the phrase "the end." So again, all these interesting connections here. Now, if we go to the 108th verse, which is actually the 110th occurrence or mention of the phrase "the end," we're actually going to find that it's actually in Habakkuk 2:3, which is important because this is one of the most pivotal passages concerning the vision of the end. It says, "For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry." And as I talked about at the beginning in the intro of this video, the Lord essentially was tarrying since 2022, which is the initial appointed time. But in the Seven Thunders event, He will not tarry. And again, this phrase "not tarry" is word 88 in the chapter, because again, 88 is connected to that point where He no longer tarries, where there is no more time, or as the license plate in Back to the Future says, "out of time." And so we're waiting for that moment where the Lord will no longer tarry. It's worth mentioning that the word "it" occurs, I believe, 5 times in this verse, but the first and last mentions of the word "it" are actually giving us a clue to something. It says, "But at the end, it," and we should want to know what "it" is referring to, "shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry." Well, the first "it" in Habakkuk 2:3 is the 4,752nd occurrence of that word in Scripture, and that breaks down to 88 times 2 times 27. And so again, we have a reference to that 88 sequence at the end coming up to 227. Again, we saw this connection earlier in one of the other convergences that we were looking at. It's also 2 times 22. Again, we're looking for a second 22 times 108, which would be converge here as well. Furthermore, it is 8, again, reference to new beginnings or new birth, times 3 times 198. Remember, there are 3 instances of 198. Verse 198 is the verse that has that 227 date. And so we're looking for 3 of those, as we see here. Interestingly, 3 times 8 is also 24, and the first 198 was in 2024. So some additional information, actually, if we pay attention to that. Furthermore, though, this number 4,752, which again is related to this word for it we see right here, is 12 times 396. 12 represents a year. Now, specifically, we're looking now. For a while, it appeared this is the 396 that we were hoping the Lord would come. We realized there was a second set represented, which we can see represented here, which is leading to that third one. If we're looking at the individual counts, and so we have a reference to 12 times 396, which we're hoping it is the end of this. And furthermore, there's one more factorization worth noting. 4,752 is 27, which is God's number for the church, times 176, or times 11 times 16. Well, 227, this pivotal date, actually is November 16th in 2028. The last it, which we can see here in Habakkuk 2:3, is the 4,756th, why did I put an ND? Occurrence in Scripture. And that breaks down to 58 times 2 times 13 prime. So 58 is God's voice, or the number for his voice is a trumpet. I covered that in the previous study. 2 times 13, as we talked about already, is a reference to the blessed hope, Titus 2:13 being one example of that. And furthermore, if we break down, now we're looking to look at the first and last mentions of it. One was 4,752, the other was 4,756, as far as their mention count. The product of their digits is interesting. 4 times 7 times 5 times 2 equals 280, or equals 10. God's number for time, times 28. So the time of 28. It's also 4 times 7 times 5 times 6 equals 10 times 84, or 10 times 2 times 20 plus 22. So the time of 2 2022s. And again, the second 2022 is the reset, the one that we're waiting for. And so we're looking at once upon a time and the end. Now we're just going to look about this phrase, a time, once upon a time. The phrase a time occurs 59 times, which, and by the way, 59 is the 17th prime number. It's God's number for victory. And it is first found in Joshua 8:14, which we can see here. And it came to pass, when the kings of Ai saw it, that they hasted and rose up early, and the men of the city went out against Israel to battle, he and all his people at a time appointed before the plain, but he wist not that there were liers in ambush against him behind the city. This makes me think, that there might be some nefarious scheme involving AI right before the church is taking. But again, whatever the scheme of the enemy that might be related to AI is going to be thwarted by this ambush of the Lord, which is represented by Joshua. Remember, Yehoshua and Yeshua both mean God is salvation. They're both basically, Joshua is another name for Jesus in Hebrew, and so it's not a coincidence that we'd have this in the book of Joshua. But the other thing that obviously hopefully would stand out is that this is Joshua 8:14, and this offers a connection to Genesis 8:14, which is the verse of the 227 date of the end. The phrase a time is word or phrase 476 in the chapter, and that is 17. Again, God's number for victory. And again, by the way, 59 is the 17th prime number, times 28. So reference to, shorthand reference to 2028. And the phrase a time, which we see here, is word 162,207 in the Bible. Again, so we have a reference to 162 again, which is, the Hebrew value for the end, and it equals 3 times 2 times 27. So we have the reference to 3 227s. 207 is 9 times 23, so the fruit of that 23 reverse sequence, but that's also the Hebrew value for the word raz, which means secret. And we see that word used in Daniel 2:47. And so if we go to which I was going to pull up earlier, Daniel 2:47. Now this is just more confirmation that it is related to this 2023 reversal. It says 47 actually is one of the ways that God represents that sequence. Remember earlier we saw that 576 is the triangle number of 24 plus the triangle number of 23. Well, 24 plus 23 is 47. That's one of the ways that God will often refer to the sequences through 47. It's also God's number 4, something that happens again or repeats. But in this case, God's letting us know of a particular secret. I'll just read the verse and I'll show the secret. It says, "The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret." Well, it's now at the time of the end. Now we have the book of the Lord, which is the King James Bible. It's perfectly measured and perfectly accounted for. We can now measure and see what God's secret is. The word secret here, you can see, is word 2023 in the book of Daniel. Or hopefully you guys can see that. It's really small font. Unfortunately, I can't increase it. But you can see that the word secret is word 2023 in the book of Daniel. And that, again, this 2023 reversal, which actually began back here, is one of God's secrets. It's this sequence that began at the end of the flood repayment in 2023 and the beginning of 2024 that continues all the way to the end. And again, at the end of that reverse sequence is the blessing of the rapture. And it's definitely a secret. But to go back to this study, though, it's interesting that the phrase "a time" is word or phrase 162,207 in the Bible. And the last word in this verse, in Joshua 8:14, is word 162,227 in the Bible. So now we have, reference to the 227s, but then we even end with another reference to 227 again, just concealed as 227. And I guess I could show that really quick now that I think about it, just so you guys can see this. So we go to a time, we can see that it is word 162,207, but if we go to the last word in that verse, we can see that it is 162,227. And there's also 58 words in this verse, and 58 is God's number for his voice as a trumpet, which is linked to the end as well, obviously. So again, I don't know if this is God just basically doubling down to make it clear that the 162 needs to be divided into 3 representations of 227, or if God could possibly be indicating, as I said earlier, is there some other continuation of 227 that he has not yet revealed? That we have the 3, and then is there some 4th, rendition or reckoning of 227 that God has yet to reveal? That's either prior or after. So far, I don't see any strong evidence of that being the case, but and it doesn't line up with the other things God has been showing. But again, I want to remain humble about this because back in 2025, it really did appear that this was the end. But then God showed that the double payment and the other pieces of evidence that 2025 would echo, that there'd be the second rendition. So again, I think God, as we approach the day, He's going to show us, but we won't ever know for sure. We will only see by faith. And one thing I want to point out, that day. So we see here, it says in 1 Thessalonians 5:4, it says, "But ye brethren are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief." Well, I think God's concealing that day right here, which is 5:4. Remember, if you drop the colon, it's basically 54. 54, again, is 2 times 27. It's that day of the end. And here's why I think it really is that day. Because look at the chapter. The chapter is 116, or 11:16. And November 16th in 2028 is 227, or 54, if you want to look at it that way. And this is also verse 62 in the chapter, and again, 62 is God's number for the hourglass. So I think there's all this evidence that God now, as he says here, he says, you are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. So I now believe we may be at the point, again, I believe in faith, not knowing, but just believing that God may be indeed showing us what that day is, so that it does not overtake us as a thief. And again, the fact that we're still here means that God is giving us a great deal of time, relatively speaking, but also not much time, to warn the rest of the church and those who are lost that day is approaching. And one of the things I've been just wrestling with in my mind is is God's timing. Obviously, it's up to Him. Now, I could, on one hand, I could see it easily taking from here to 2028 to alert the church. And the church may not finally wake up until this very last moment. Those of you who are watching might just be like the early watchmen to some of this information. On the other hand, it's I hope that the Lord would want what is being shared here to come out sooner, so that we have more of this time leading up to this point to let the church know, to wake the church up that is asleep, and also to that we then have an understanding of this timeline at the end as that motivation, the fire beneath the feet, so to speak, to cause us to run to the end, and to try to reach the lost, try to be about the Father's business in this final stretch. And so, again, I don't know the Lord's timing with this. I'm hoping that this information will get out to the rest of the church sooner than later. But it may be, through all this time, I've been basically as of 2022. This ministry, I've been trying to let the church know that, hey, we missed the initial appointed time in 2022, but God is tarrying, but He is going to come again in this second accounting of it, which is this reset event tied to the seven thunders. In all that time, though, there's been obviously those of you here are watching this, but in total there might be a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people in the church that are aware of even some of what's being shared here. And my hope is that the church would, it took 3 years and very few people have come to the knowledge. And again, that's, I think, part of me wants to be critical on my inability to articulate and express what God showed in 2022 and subsequently thereafter. But then another part of me realizes that God is sovereign, that God has probably put the brakes on a lot of this, in His perfect timing, that God is allowing this slow burn, this slow release of what He's showing, so that everything falls into place at the perfect timing. And things can change like that with God. Like God could quickly arrange all the pieces to fall into place, so that this quickly comes out to the rest of the church. However, God could also realize that we might need another 2.5 years for a lot of this to be made known before the rest of the church sees that day approaching. Right now, I think we're blessed if you are watching this and you can see in faith that God, I do believe, is showing us that day right here. Again, it's 54. It's 2 times 27. It's that 227 date that we read about in Genesis 8:14, which happens to be November 16th in 2028. But at any rate, one other thing I want to share here is that when we look at the notation, Joshua's book 6 plus 8 plus 14 is 28. And so we have another reference to 28. And as I just mentioned, there are 58 words in Joshua 8:14, which is a reference to his voice as a trumpet. Furthermore, if we look at the product of this, book 6 times 8 times 14 is 672, which is 2 times 336. And again, 336 was the English Standard value for the end, which we looked at earlier. The last mention of it in Joshua 8:14 is significant. It is the 1685th mention of the word "it" in the Bible, and I do want to let you guys know we're coming towards the end of this study. I know it's been a long study, but we're kind of getting towards the end, hopefully. But it basically, that is 5 times 337. Now, again, as already covered, 5 is God's number for grace. It's also God's abbreviated number for the rapture. But the number 337 is important because it's linked to this altar that is symbolically linked to the end. The 337th mention of the word altar is in Ezekiel 43:15, and it is the word Harel in Hebrew, which means mountain of God, but it is H2025 in Strong's, and this is the only verse where this word occurs. So literally this number is pointing via the word altar to the only verse in Scripture where this entry, which represents 2025, occurs. But actually, if you look in that verse, the word altar occurs twice, which probably was a clue for us. Well, not probably, it was a clue for us. I said probably because I didn't pay attention to it as much as I should have prior to the end of 2025. But at any rate, if we go to, we can see here, Ezekiel 43:15. It doesn't show it here, but if you look up in concordance, you can see that this word altar is H2025. And then obviously it's number 43. 43 is 23 plus 20. God is encoding a reference to that 2023 reversal. 15 is one of God's numbers for something that repeats or happens again. So God was actually even giving us a clue with this verse that something was going to repeat or happen again. In this case, we actually know there's two different staves or staffs to the 2023 reversal or primary sequences. God is also providing the clue that 2025 would repeat or occur again, which is indicated by the number 15. We'll see another example of that soon. But you can see that the word altar occurs twice. The first one, though, which you can see here, is the 337th occurrence that it occurs, which is important because this relates to another instance of the altar, which is in verse 337 in the Bible, which is Genesis 13:18. And it contains a notable reference to the altar, which is word 454 in Genesis 13. So if I look back here, and I've covered this in previous studies, so I'm bouncing around a lot right now. I know I'm going pretty quick, but that's because I just want to show some of the primary connections. But you can see that the word altar is word 454. This number 454, God will often use to reference this altar of the end that is connected to 45 and 54. 45, again, is 20 plus 25. 54 is 2 times 27. So God is linking this altar of the end to 2025 and 227, which I just mentioned here. The number 454 relates to 2025 and 227. This link is hinted at in the mention count for it, which you see here in Joshua 8:14. The word it is word 450 in Joshua 8, and it is word 54:45 in Joshua. And so again, it's not just, we have these connections here, but then God quite simply makes it very clear by the position count for this word in Joshua 8 and Joshua. So it's 450 in the chapter, and it's 54:45 in Joshua, again, connecting those to those things that are related to the altar of the end. 450 is 5 times 2 times 20 plus 25. So you have the reference to the rapture linked to two 2025s. 54 represents 54 and 45. Additionally, 54:45 is 11 times 45, I believe. I think so, right? No, what is it? 54:45. I know it's divisible by 11. Okay, that's God's promises. Okay, that's what it was. Okay. It's 11 squared times 45. So I knew 11 was involved. The reason the 11 squared is important is 11 is God's number for blessing and judgment, but also it's related to this geometric puzzle God hints at in Ezekiel 43. And remember, one of the references to this is in Ezekiel 43. Actually, that might be a huge blessing to show that to you guys. So I'm going to, it might take me just a bit to find it. I'm probably going to do a separate study on this, so this is going to be a little bit of a sneak peek. The end thereof, I believe, is what it was called. Is it the beginning from the end? Nope. Sorry, I should have had this up, but I didn't think about it until just now that this would be an awesome tie-in if I could find it. Unfortunately, I have so many different studies and slide sets, it's difficult to find some of these things sometime. Dimensions might be the Mysteries of Job, mountains. The Mysteries of Job is another study I want to do sometime soon. Leavening the lump. It might be leavening the lump now that I think about it, which is... Yeah, here we go. Okay, so I think I found it. Sorry about this, guys. I'm probably actually going to end... I'm probably not going to do the other studies I was going to do at the end just because I'm adding this. But anyway, as I mentioned, we're talking about how... So I'm going to go here. We're looking at the word it here, which is insignificant. And whenever got the italicized words in the King James Bible are usually significant. Because if you look at the Hebrew and Greek, that means basically they were added to make things more clear, but you wouldn't find the original Hebrew or Greek source for it. And so for a lot of scholars, they would pay even less attention to them. But actually, because I know that the King James Bible is the book of the Lord, I actually pay more attention to them because I know that God is revealing something in the English that could only be revealed in the English with that particular account. In this case, we know that 54:45 is significant, but we're going to look at that the Greek entry for 54:45 is this word for lump, where it says a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. And 5 times 9 is 45, or 20 plus 25. And obviously 54 is 2 times 27. So God is talking about 3 years after the initial appointed time of 1111. I talked about this earlier, actually, in the intro, the 3 hidden years. I'm just going to skip ahead because I want to get to this, to the 11 axis symmetry line. So, like I said, this number is 11 squared times 45. Well, 11 is not just God's number for blessing or judgment. It's also represents this axis of symmetry that God often refers to. So if you do a 10 by 10 cube, you'll notice that this axis of symmetry are multiple 11s. So you have 11, 22, 33, 44, 55, and you'll notice that 54 and 45 are at the center of this axis of symmetry. You'll notice that if you go basically out from the 45, you have 47 and 15, which are 2 of God's numbers for again. So God is giving 2 different clues that 45 or 2025 would repeat or occur again. And also, but if you go out from them, you get to 17, which is God's number for victory. Here's what's incredible. If you go from 17 back to 45, 17 times 45 is 765, which is 5, God's number for the rapture, times 153, which is related to the fish harvest. Remember, there's 153 fish captured in John 21, and that's symbolic of the fish harvest. So if we look at the convergence of 2025, which is represented by 45, but we look at specifically the convergence of again for it, which is 15 and 47, it comes to this number 17, which relates to this. Again, this is a sneak preview of another study I was hoping to do. And also we see 44 here and 55. 44 represents the 2022 reset, as we talked about. 55 is 11 times 5, or the blessing of the rapture. So there's a lot that's found at the center of this. But here's what's amazing. The center sum of this is 198. 44 plus 45 plus... and all I've done here is just gone 0 through 9, 10 through 19, 20. It's basically just counting up to 99 from 0 in a cube. And God actually gives a hint to this in Scripture, which I think I touch on here. But at any rate, this center block adds up to 198. Again, verse 198 in the Bible is Genesis 8:14, which gives the account for the end of the flood on 227. But additionally, even the outside values add up to 198 as well. So we're getting a hint that there's another accounting, if you will, of that date. I already mentioned that. So the only chapter in the Bible that contains the word Harel, which is H2025, is Ezekiel 43, and makes an allusion to a pattern in verse 10, and we're looking at a 10 by 10 cube. In the primary context, verse 10 concerns the pattern of the temple, but it also conceals a reference to the pattern of an ordinal square. Thou son of man, show the house to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern. So again, there's a historic and a physical application to this verse related to the temple. But God often likes to put riddles in his word. Psalms 47 is an example I've covered in the past, where he says, lo, I come in the volume of the book. Well, if you look at the volume of the book, the Lord actually shows you when he comes. But at any rate, there's a little riddle that's going on here too. He says, measure the pattern. Well, if you measure the pattern of 10 or 10 by 10 square, there's other clues that God provides to this that I'm not sharing here. But anyway, God is giving a clue to measure this pattern. And so, anyway, the only chapter in the Bible that contains the word Harel is Ezekiel 43. Ezekiel 43:10 is verse 11:18 in Ezekiel. And 227, which is the date of the 198th verse, was November 18th in 2025. But again, remember, we have to go out to 47 and 15 to see that it's going to repeat again. The very next verse mentions ordinances and account related to the pattern thereof. So here, this is the very next verse that follows. It says in verse 11, which again, you have this 11-axis symmetry, and we're going to see how this all ties in. And if they be ashamed of all that they have done, show them the form of the house and the fashion thereof, and the goings out thereof, and the comings in thereof, and the forms thereof, and all the ordinances thereof, and all the forms thereof, and all the laws thereof, and write it in their sight, that they may keep the whole form thereof, and all the ordinances thereof, and do them. So you think that God really wanted to use the word thereof a lot in this verse, right? It's not an accident. God, again, this is no detail in God's word is an accident. So Ezekiel 43:11 has 9 mentions of the word thereof, which is the most mentions in any verse. The word and position count for each thereof in Ezekiel 43:11 are prophetically significant. So this one, for example, is word 22. This one's 27. This is 32. But at any rate, this is the sequence you get if you number each of the thereofs. When you add them all together, when we add all the thereofs together, remember he's saying measure the pattern. And when we went back here, we had a sum of 198 on the inside. And remember, there's also a sum of 198 on the outside. 198 plus 198 is 396. And God is just providing another witness to this with the thereofs. When you add all of thereofs together, you get 396, which again is 2 times 198. This represents 2 instances of 227 occurring again. And again, 396 is a reference to 198 plus 198, this last set. Again, God provided the starting point, because remember, Ezekiel 43:10, which is telling us to measure the pattern, is verse 11:18. Well, November 18th was 227 in 2025. And so we're going 396 from 11:18 and 2025 when we measure the pattern. Furthermore, not only do all the thereofs add up to 396 when you look at their word counts, but this is just incredible. The last word in the verse, Ezekiel 43:11, is word 396 in the chapter. And so you can even say we have 396 represented once and 396 represented again when you look at it that way. I don't want to do that. I want to go to Ezekiel. Okay, where I'm going brain dead right now. Lot to consider right now. Ezekiel's got to be back here. Yeah, I'm having a brain fart. Okay, so we go to the so we're going to Ezekiel 43:11, where it mentions all the thereofs. So we have all the thereofs that add up to 396, and we can see that the last word in the verse is also 396. So God's given 2 different witnesses pointing to 396, and he gives us the date by the verse that we should look or consider, which is 11:18, which we can see here. So we can see where he says measure the pattern. That is verse 11:18. Well, November 18th was Heshvan 27, or 227 in 2025. And remember, this chapter contains the only mention of that H2025 word. And so God's giving many clues, and you look at all these different puzzle pieces, they all kind of converge to show what he's showing. But anyway, the very next verse mentions ordinances and account related to the pattern thereof. The word thereof is a witness to the 454 secret of the altar, which I just showed a little bit ago. The word thereof occurs 908 times in the King James Bible, and that is 2 times 45, or 2454. Again, 45 represents 2025, 54 represents 2 times 27. This another way we can look at this is God is showing, hey, there's 2 45s and 2 54s in the reckoning of the end. And here's just another breakdown showing visually how we have 2 times those pairs. We have 2x essentially of 2025, 2x of 227, well, specifically in the sequence of the end, and 2x obviously of the 222. So anyway, and obviously 454 itself divided is 2 times 227, which looks like 227. Okay, so let me see. I think I'm going to stop it there because... Oh, here's another clue. Remember I said that there's the 3 measures of meal. God indicated 3 hidden years, but then elsewhere in Scripture he indicates that there's more, that the cake has to be turned, that those 3 hidden years have to be flipped or turned over. I'm not going to get into that typology completely right now, but you could, if you want to take a snapshot of this, you might be able to glean that connection. But basically, God was given a hint. Now, Ephraim is a type of the church concealed in the Old Testament. God is given that. Now, the tribe of Ephraim was not twice turned, but that the church, which is represented by typologically by Ephraim, God is saying needs to be a cake turned over. So these 3 measures of meal would have to be turned over again, if you will. So let me see, make sure. And here's a reference to 2 sticks. Remember I said earlier how the 2023 reversal in the sequence of the end is often represented by 2 sticks or 2 staves. And it mentions thereof in this verse. So again, this is, like I said, this is a sneak peek of a study I was going to do at a later time. But this last one's probably worth pointing out. Galatians 5:9 is verse 6027 in the New Testament. Well, 6 times 27 is 3 times 2 times 27. And so we have a reference to the 3 227 dates of the end. And again, the word lump here is G5445 in Strong's Concordance. So that was a little bit of an unexpected detour, but since it tied into this, I thought it was appropriate to bring it up. And like I said, I'm going to do one more study at the end of this, but then I'm going to leave off the larger study I was going to do since I introduced that and once again punt it for another time. Anyway, the last mention of it in Joshua 8:14 is significant. I already mentioned that. But when we look at this, though, the other thing that's interesting is 5 times 3 times 3 times 7 is 315, which is 7 times 20 plus 25, or the fullness of 2025. And the word altar also, by the way, occurs 378 times in the Bible. The last word in Genesis 8:14 is word 378 in the chapter. So again, if I do altar, you can see it occurs 378 times. If I go to Genesis 8:14, you can see that the last word is word 378. Same as the count for altar. The 378th occurrence of altar, it's the last mention of altar, is in Revelation 16:7, and the product of that verse is interesting. 66 times 16 times 7 is 7,392, and that is, it breaks down into several notable things. It breaks down to 84 times 88, so a reference to 2 times 42, or the 2022 reset, and 88 is the sequence leading to the end. It's also 42 times 176. Now remember, we're waiting for the second 2022 that is linked to the end, and 176 is 11 times 16, or could, as we're seeing, be a reference to November 16th in 2028. This number is also 22 times 336. Again, 336 is the value for the end in standard English. And obviously we saw all the other things that are codified in the number 336 earlier. One of them being 22 or 12 times 28, but we could see that 7,392 is also 12 times 28, or 22 times 28. So we have a reference to the years 22 and 28. Remember, 2022 and 2028 are the bookends of this sequence of the end. Once upon a time, the phrase once occurs 59 times in the Bible. The phrase a time also occurs 59 times in the Bible. So we see 59 repeated twice. 59 is the, like I said, is the 17th prime number, but also 5 times 9 is 45. And so God's given us a clue that 45 or 20 plus 25 or 2025 occurs twice when we just consider this phrase once upon a time. The last verse of book 59, which is James, is verse 30,375 in the Bible. And by the way, that is verse 108 in that book. And 30,375 is 15 times 2025. These factors represent 2025 occurring again. I think I talked about in the previous video how the numbers 15 and 47 are two numbers God uses for something that happens again or repeats. So God was structurally, in the 108th verse of James, which is book 59 in the Bible, giving us a clue that 2025 would occur again. Another way we could think of this, though, these factors indicate a new 2025. The new one is the one that repeats again. And God's number for new, as we talked about earlier, is 8. It can be new birth, new beginning, resurrection, or just simply something that's new. And when we look at this, 8 times 2025 is 16,200, which breaks down to 100 times 162, or 10 squared, the fullness of time, times 3 times 2 times 27. And again, 162 is the Hebrew value for the end. And so again, just an interesting connection there, that we have this link between the new 2025, which would be the echo, and the fullness of time in 3 227s. Again, just represented here, we're waiting for that 2025 echo. We have the three 227s that we're looking toward at this point. So with that, like I said, I was going to do this study on the ends, but I think I'm going to save this for another time because I took that other side study. I don't want this to be bloated more than it can be. Really quickly, before I get into my last study, I just wanted to show this little snippet from Back to the Future to hopefully encourage you guys to go back and watch the previous series, Back to the Rapture, and see what God has codified. Like I said, it's the third video, or the third part in this series where I finally get into this. I'm just showing you one little part right here. This is the scene where Marty's, if you guys have seen the movie, he's clinging onto the back of this Jeep on a skateboard, basically hitching a ride. And at one point, the Lord showed me how Jeep, G-E-E-P, is actually related to Jesus, like a statement, like a concealed, like an acronym, if you will. Maybe I'll share that some other time. But anyway, you have this license plate of 726BXG on the vehicle. 726, many of you know, is the Greek entry in Strong's Concordance for Harpazo, which is where we get the word rapture from. It means to snatch out or away. And so we have a reference to the rapture just by the number 726 here. The standard English alphanumeric value for BXG, as you can see here, is 198. 12 plus 144 plus 42 is 198. And obviously that should stick out by now as the verse of that 227 date. So God is foreshadowing in this symbolic narrative what's coming ahead. But at any rate, here he is on the Jeep going further down the road, and they're passing this interstate sign for Interstate 8, indicating a new 198 ahead. It's also in conjunction with 395. 395 is 5 times 22 prime, the rapture and that 22 prime event. And this is the part that I mentioned earlier in the intro, just as a preview. So if we go to the first verse of the Bible, again, remember God declares the end from the beginning. God has codified something here that is being expressed symbolically in Back to the Future. So later in the film, so right now he's just hitching a ride, and again, God is just foreshadowing what's to come. But later in the film, this is actually the road that he travels 88 miles per hour on in order to travel back to 1985. And it's down 395. If you go to 395, it is in Genesis, or if we go to the word the heaven in Genesis 1:1, its Hebrew value. So this row here is the Hebrew values, and the one beneath is the English values. The Hebrew value is 395 for the heaven, and then we have that reference here. 88 is the English ordinal value, which we see here. Remember, he went 88 miles per hour down 395 later, and that was to take him back to 1985. Well, if you go to the subsequent words and the earth, remember in the last letter, H, is the 44th letter. Again, 44 is 2 times 22. You can see that the English values for and the earth are 1985. I'll just show that really quick. So if I do and, you can see that it is 19. And if I do the earth, you can see that it is 85. And that's exactly how this occurs to, when you break it down. This is, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. You can see here that those break down, and the Hebrew words are and the earth, which is 19 and 85. And so God has literally got this story of him going to 88 miles per hour down 395, which you see here, to go to 1985. 1985 follows. It leads to the hook, which I talked about in the second video of the last series, is symbolic of that thing that hooks us in the rapture. But anyway, God is creating this symbol to get us to the end of Genesis 1:1, which is connected to 1985. But really, what God has codified at the end of Genesis 1:1 is related to all these other ends that we've studied. And again, and here's the thing too that's interesting. Remember, so October 26th, October is the 10th month. 10 is God's number for time. 26 is 2 times 13, the blessed hope. And so the date in this case is not looking towards the date of the rapture, but rather it's codifying something related to the rapture. Again, number 10, God's number for time. 26 is 2 times 13. Remember, Hebrews 12:26 talks about how he will shake the heavens and the earth. But then obviously Titus 2:13, 2 times 13 is 26. But they also have a reference to 22:20 or 2022 encoded in reverse by the minutes, a reference to that 2022 reset. So again, there's a lot that is encoded there. The 19 times 85 is 1615, and I covered this more in the video, so I'm not going to go into this now. But basically, there is actually a connection here. But so all that said, I wanted to share that before getting into this final study about faith, and because a lot of these things require faith, and it's interesting that God plays on this theme of faith in a verse that is concealing many things related to the end. We see that here in Luke 18:8. And so I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth. Luke 18:8 conceals many mysteries concerning when the Son of Man cometh again for the church. The sum of the verse notation is 68, which is 42 plus 18 plus 8. The word secret occurs 68 times in the King James Bible. Luke 18 is chapter 62 in the New Testament. 62, as we talked about already, is the number of the hourglass. The product of the verse notation is 6,048. So basically, Luke is book 42 times 18 times 8 is 648. Broken down another way, or just it's 6 times 12 times 84. I haven't talked about this too much yet. 6, obviously, many of you know, is the number of man, but another way that God will often use 6 prophetically is in reference to his millennial calendar. There are 6 days appointed to man, or 6 days of work before the 7th day of rest. But in this case, the 6 days represent 6,000 years, where a day is as 1,000 years. And so we have reference to day 6, a reference to a year, and 84, as we talked about, represents the 2022 reset, 2 times 20 plus 22. Furthermore, 6,048 equals 28 times 216. And again, this just ties into what we see here. We have 108 plus 108 is 216. 216 basically leads up to 28. And we have that shown here. Yeah, again, 216 is 2 times 108, which breaks down to 2 times 27. But also, just quite simply, 216 is 8 times 27, and 827 is Heshvan 27 on the modern Hebrew calendar. Again, I thought I didn't put this in the chart, which is why I went to the other one. But yeah, at any rate, we can see 108 plus 108 is 216, leading up to 28 or 2028. This is what blew me away. Okay, 6,048 is also 16 times 378. As we just saw, Genesis 8:14 ends with word 378 in the chapter. It says, and in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. Again, this is the end of the flood, but God is reflecting this in his plan for the end. So again, we break it all down. We have the 6, we have a reference to day 6 on the millennial calendar. 48 can be 20 plus 28, a reference to 2028. 2, we have a reference to 2 times 27, and Genesis 8:14. And so we have all these things that are referenced in this product, where Jesus is talking about when the Son of Man cometh. We have a reference to day 6 on the millennial calendar. We have a reference to 2028 encoded. We have a reference to 227, and we have a reference to 8:14 via the products, the factors 8 and 14, which again, Genesis 8:14 is the verse that talks about the 227 date, and it has 307. It ends with word 378, which is also a factor of this product. By the way, Genesis 8:14 has a value of 2,701 in Hebrew, which is the same exact value of Genesis 1:1. That's another reason why we look at Genesis 1:1, because Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 8:14 have a lot of parallels, and they actually have the same exact numeric value in Hebrew. They both end with the same Hebrew word, and they both end with the letter Zadi. We have basically what we see here is an encoding of 2028. It encodes an end with Zadi, and obviously, as I just mentioned, Genesis 8:14 ends with Zadi. So there are obviously when we're looking at factors, we could realize that there are other verses in the Bible that will have a similar product. One of the other verses that has the same product of this is Job, and as I talked about earlier, there's a whole series on the mysteries of Job that I want to cover later. But if we go to Job, which is book 18, 42:8, we can see that it has the same product. It's book 18 times 42 times 8. You'll get the same result. But that verse, Job 42:8, is pretty significant. It says, "Therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job," and Job symbolically represents the church, "and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, as my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept, lest I deal with you after your folly, and that ye have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job." Now, again, if I did the full study on Job, you'll recognize that there's something being encoded in reference to the thing. I'm just going to cut to the chase, though, and show it's being encoded here. Job 42:8 has 62 words, which again is related to the hourglass, and as it so happens, Luke 18 is chapter 62 in the New Testament. The word thing here is word 198 in Job 42, so we have a reference to verse 198. And furthermore, the word thing is word 378, 650 in the Bible. We just saw the 378 reference. So again, reference to verse 198, which ends with word 378 in the chapter. 650, though, is 13 times 50, the number of a Jubilee, or 13 times 2 times 25. Reference to the 7 thunders, and obviously a reference to 2 25s. Furthermore, if we just look at this number, break it down, it is 2 times 25 times 31 squared prime. 31 is another number of dividing. In the interest of time, I think I'm just going to not go into that detour and move on. The last place where the phrase "of me" occurs, which is mentioned here, is in Revelation 3:18. And there are 45 words in Revelation 3:18. Again, 45 is reference to 2025, and 3:18 equals 2 times 27. But the phrase "of me" is phrase 528 in the chapter, and that is 12 times 44. So basically the year of the 2022 reset. But furthermore, 528 is 11. Again, the odds number for blessing or judgment times 48, or 20 plus 28. But it's also 3 times 176. And as we saw in the timeline, there are 3 years from the 227 in 2025 to 227 again in 2028, which is on November 16th. And 176 is 11 times 16. The notation product of Revelation 3:18 is 3,564, and that is 9 times 396. And so we have, again, fruit of the a reference to the fruit, and God wants fruit of this harvest to come forth, and 396, which is that number we've seen many times. Obviously, we saw it with the thereof passage. and obviously it represents 198 times 2. But furthermore, this number is also 6 times 3 times 198. Again, this reference to 6, I believe, would be a reference to day 6 on God's millennial calendar. God's showing basically the end point, if you will, of that day. The word Cometh is word 57,672 in the New Testament, and that breaks down to 2 times 108 times 3 times 24 prime, or 3 times 54 times 4 times 24 prime. And so this is actually represented a couple different things. For this one, we've had 4 years from 2024 that encompass the 3 54s. Remember, 227 can be represented as 54. And so we have a reference there when we look at this set. But then we also, up above, we have a reference to 2 sets of 108 and 3 times 24 there. The word cometh is word 667,953 in the Bible. That breaks down to 33, which is the number for God's promises, times 117, God's number for resurrection and dividing. 40, many of you know, usually represents a period of wandering. For example, the 40 years of wandering in the desert in the Exodus. The word when is word 135 in the chapter, and it says, when the Son of Man cometh. 135 is 3 times 45, or 5 times 27, the rapture of the church. If we go a little bit further down to verse 27, we see this. And he said, the things which are impossible with men are possible with God. So 8:27 is notable because that 227 date that we keep on seeing, that's mentioned in Genesis 8:14, on a modern Hebrew calendar, it would actually be 8:27. Because remember, back in Exodus chapter 12, God had Moses change the start of the month. And so everything's basically offset but by 6 months now. And so everything's been kind of offset. So basically 227 now would be 8:27 on a modern Hebrew calendar. The product of the verse notation that we see here is 42 times 18 times 27. That's 20,412. And that breaks down to 2 times 27 times 378. It's also 28 times 27 squared, so the fullness of the church in 28. It's also 162, which we saw is reference to the end, times 126, the fullness of 18. 18 is God's number for the body of the church. It's also God's number for heaven. And so we have a reference to either the fullness of the body of the church or the fullness of heaven. I think both may be applicable in this case. Furthermore, this number is 84, reference to the 2022 reset, times 9, so fruit, times 27. So 2022 reset and the fruit of the church. Again, all the things which are impossible with men are impossible with God. God's the one who's going to bring forth the fruit of his kingdom, of his harvest. And then we go to a parallel phrase in Matthew and Mark. We see something interesting when we look at the same parallel phrase. It says, but Jesus beheld them and said unto them, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. That's Matthew 19:26. And Jesus, looking upon them, saith, with men it is possible, but not with God, for with God all things are possible. Well, these two bridge phrases have, the first in Matthew has 20 words, the second, possible, in Mark has 22. So the 2022 reset is something that is only possible with God. Basically, we think of time travel. We think of the Back to the Future analogy is impossible with man, at least going back to the future. But now the 2022 reset's not going to be time travel in the sense that we think of time travel, but it is going to be a reset of God's clock. And so, and that's the better analogy for us would be like taking a clock during daylight savings times and pulling the hour or the minute hand back. That's basically what God's going to do so that his clock is at the right time when he comes. But his clock that he has to pull back is basically the sun, moon, planets, the array of the solar system, if you will. It's astronomical. So we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, how it's going to unfold. We do know it's a heaven and earth shaking event, as I talked about. Hebrews 12 26, for example, it mentions this as, remember, 26 is 2 times 13, a reference to the seven thunders and the blessed hope. It said, whose voice then shook the earth, but now he hath promised, saying, yet once, and we're looking at the study on once upon a time, yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. So basically the heavens are going to be shaken too in this clock reset event. And again, it seems like something that's impossible, but with God, all things are possible. The phrase all things, by the way, occurs 220 times in the Bible, which is 10 times 22, or 5, number for the grace and the rapture, times 2 times 22. So the 222s. And obviously, there's another application related to salvation with the 22 as well, because 22 is representative of the cross via the Tav. Matthew 19:26 contains the 54th mention of the phrase all things, and Mark 10:27 contains the 64th mention of the phrase all things. The reason that now the 54th mention should already be obviously, the importance of that should be obvious. The 64th mention won't be as obvious unless you've followed a lot of the other studies. 64 is 2 times 32, and 32 is one of the ways that God represents the sequence of the 2023 reversal that is linked to 2025. Basically, 32 is 23 flipped. And I haven't done a study on that in a while, but basically, in short, 32 represents the sequence of the 2023 reversal connected to 2025. But as we found out, 2025 doesn't just occur once, it occurs twice. So that 32 would also have to be added again. So 32 plus 32 is 64. There may be other significance to this as well. For example, 64th is also 8 squared. 8 can represent something that's new, obviously we talked about, but 8 also represents the gate. It's another way to represent the door. And so it could be representation of the fullness of this moment that we come into the gates of heaven. There's a lot of other applications that may be in view, but the one that stuck out to me, based on the studies that the Lord had been leading me through, was the 2 times 32 reference. But at any rate, when we just break these numbers down, 1926 is 18 times 28 prime, a reference to 18 referencing heaven, and 28, and then also 1027 is 13, God's number for the seven thunders, times 22 prime. And so just a very interesting connection there as well. So I think that's where I'm going to end this study. Like I said, I did have another study I was going to do, but just because of how much time we've spent on this video, I think I'm going to cut it here, and hopefully I will get the leavening the lump video in another video at some point. Like I said, I kind of unexpectedly brought that one up because it kind of tied into what we're looking at. I hope to do a more full study on it at some point and slow down to really break it down more. I kind of rushed through it just so I could get to the rest of this study. But again, I hope this is a blessing. Again, if you haven't seen the previous series, Back to the Rapture, it sets up the context for a lot of what is shared here. And with all that said, I hope this is a blessing. At this point, I had ideas about what I was going to be working on next. And I still haven't got around to the larger update that I wanted to do. At this point, I'm just letting the Lord guide me kind of day by day, week by week, in terms of steering where he wants me to go with both the studies and with the timing of presenting these things. And so I may return back to the volume of the book series that I had started working on back in 2025 at some point to add resolution to what he showed there, specifically the tying of the second 2025, and finish that sequence. There's another thing that the Lord brought to my attention recently that I might start working on that is larger in scope. It might take actually a year or a year and a half to complete. At this point, it looks like we actually have that time. Again, God could always reveal something that shows it's going to be sooner, that modifies how this day speaks. But right now, I think God wants to confidently show us that this is at least the next major milestone we're looking toward. And so while we shouldn't be slack, I think that does give us some room to be about the Father's business. For me personally, you guys each need to individually seek the Lord and see what he would have you do with its time. for me, I feel like I can proceed in good conscience to make something that is longer and larger in scope, knowing that I do believe we have this much time before the Lord comes. So I'm willing at this point, again, as long as it's the Lord that's leading me, to start something that might take a year or a year and a half to complete, a larger video series and project, because I know we'll have at least, let's say it's done by the end of 2027. That still gives a little more than a year before potentially we come to that end point. And so, and hopefully a year would be enough time for the church to respond. But like I said, I hope actually that in this season now in 2026, that a lot of what's being shared here will actually get out to the church sooner, so that we have more time to reach the lost, more time to reach lost loved ones. Those are just lost around the world who need the message of the gospel, and also those who need to wake up and realize that the times and the seasons that we are living in. Jesus said, you guys can tell the face of the weather, but how can you not tell that the times? And so, and I'm obviously paraphrasing there, but I think God does expect us, and He certainly expected Jerusalem, the leaders of Jerusalem and Israel, at His first coming, to know the timing of His arrival, and many of them didn't. And so, one of the primary goals we have as a follower of Christ is to spread the good news. But there is also, I think, an expectation from the Lord that we watch for His return, and that we are not ignorant of the signs and the clues that He has given us regarding His return. And again, as we saw earlier in 1 Thessalonians 5:4, He says that day will not come upon us as a thief. And I think we're now approaching that time where He's not going to let that day come out on those who are watching as a thief, because as we're watching, He's showing us just this tremendous treasure trove from Him that He's given to us, that is related to His plan for the end. And so with that, I hope this is a blessing. And I don't know when I'm going to see you guys next, what I'm going to upload next. Again, it's up to the Lord. And I hope you guys are able to enjoy what has been uploaded recently, though. And I will see you guys soon. Bye.